My name is Janna Gillis. I am a family outreach consultant with the Lester B. Pearson School Board, and I'm a member of the Center of Excellence for Mental Health. We're really excited to be here with you today at LCEEQ online and sharing with you our workshop on rediscovering resilience during COVID and beyond. So I'll give a moment to allow my colleague to introduce herself, and then I'll just run through a few housekeeping items.
I'm a psychologist with the Lester B. Pearson School Board and the Center of Excellence for Mental Health. And we are really happy to be here today. Thank you for everyone who has joined us. I know there's some familiar people in the audience. Sorry, I can't see you all. We will try and begin as soon as the presentation is shared with everyone.
Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Yes. The screen shared okay? No weird boxes?
Nope, everything's fine.
Looks
all right,
good.
Great.
Looking good, looking good. Okay.
Okay. So I'm not seeing the chat, so Zmira, you're going to manage that as well as our moderator. Okay, yes. So just a quick outline on what we're going to talk about today. We're just going to give a brief overview on stress and resilience, and then move into how we can develop resilience within ourselves. And then, of course, we want to dedicate some time to talk about how we can foster this in our students in ways that we can provide support during this time. Just a little housekeeping. We really are encouraging you to use the chat. We are a large group, which makes it a little bit challenging to mute and unmute. We do have a lot that we want to cover, but I think there's lots of ways that we can engage in the chat, and we will be encouraging you to sort of, answer some of our questions to get a sense of where things are at for you. And we will take some time between sections to answer a few questions that we'll compile throughout. So please don't hesitate. Sometimes the chat can just be a really good place to foster engagement within participants and to keep a conversation on the side going. So we encourage you to do that. So I will pass it over to Zmira, and away we go.
So hi again, everyone. I decided to start today with a couple of quotes. I would like to confess that I'm a bit of a quote junkie, and I love to share quotes with people, and I get very inspired by quotes, maybe for a few minutes and then it passes, but I do enjoy them. These quotes I found quite relevant to our situation in these times. And as a psychologist, as a mental health professional during the last year, it's been a year, right? Everyone knows that it's been a long year. Like everyone else, I've tried to figure out how to support myself, how to get through it, and how to find ways to support the schools that I work in. And usually we look for a lot of evidence-based information and what the science says about how to cope and to deal with things. And that's all well and good. But sometimes, it was my reflections a little bit over the year that sometimes we don't need always new ideas or more research findings. And sometimes we can be reminded of some of the old existing ideas that have been out there, some of them for thousands of years, that can really guide us in handling hardships and difficulties. And for me personally, that has been looking into a bit of philosophy and some very inspiring authors has been quite helpful in getting through this particular year. And this actually brings me to the next slide. Thank you, Janna. And what I'd like you to do before we start is maybe reflect a little bit on the past year for yourselves and note what one thing has helped you handle this pandemic. What is one thing that, kind of resonated with you as something that got you through this long and quite challenging year? And please, if you feel free to share this on the chat and give us a little bit of your input, we would appreciate that. We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, so I'm looking at the chat. There's some wonderful things. Some of them I can relate to. A lot of exercising, a lot of family time, things like yoga, meditation, pets, going for long walks, appreciating the simple things in life. I think we can all kind of relate to at least some of these activities or things that we have probably discovered more than we would have if this has not been, the case this year. Thank you very much for sharing. We will go to the next slide, Janna, please. So we'll switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about stress. Stress is usually viewed as almost like a bad word, right? We hear the word stress and the connotation is always kind of negative. But I'd like to remind you that sometimes stress is not always negative. And in fact, stress is a necessary part of life. And certain amounts of stress, as you can see, mild to moderate levels of stress are actually quite important for functioning. And on the graph, you can see on the left-hand side, if we are not experiencing any stress or very, very low arousal, our performance is actually not very good. And that could be, when we're sleeping and when we're fully relaxed and in a state of complete relaxation, our performance is not as adequate as it should be, right? And as the level of stress increase and the hormones that go with the stress, the cortisol increase in our bloodstream, then we do have the positive effects of stress. We are motivated, we are able to take action better, we can stay focused and pay attention better to what we're doing. And all those hormonal changes gear our bodies and our brains to be able to do so. However, we always have to keep in mind that at some level, that optimal level of stress becomes too much. And when we say too much, it means that it's either at levels that are way beyond what is considered optimal, or they have been going on for some time. So they're chronic, they're going on for periods of time that are usually not allowing us to reset in terms of our hormones and be able to reset our bodies and our physiological aspects of our bodies to restart the next level of ability to pay attention. So we need that reset in order for the stress effect to be optimal. And when we have these severe levels and the chronic kind of stress, that's when we see the negative effect. So it becomes very difficult to function, we're not thinking very clearly. And if it's chronic, it actually can lead to long-term health problems and mental health problems. So what we want to do is be able to modulate those stress effects so that they don't continue over time and we are able to reset them almost daily. Next slide, please, Janna. So when we talk about stress, we kind of think, well, what is it that really makes us stressed in everyday life? And really stress comes from the need to get things done well, right? We feel stressed when we want to do something really well. We get stressed when we're doing things that are difficult and challenging. And we get stressed when we're faced with unfamiliar changes in our lives and in our environments. And I highlighted that in red because the most unfamiliar thing happened to us with this pandemic. This is something that many of us who have encountered hardships and difficult challenges over our life, this is not something that we have encountered before. So it is very, very unfamiliar. Another point about stress is that the greater the unfamiliar change, the greater the stress. So if we're just changing, let's say we're moving, an example is if we're moving and we're moving to the next neighborhood, well, that's a little bit of a stress. Moving is always stressful, but we're not moving to an unfamiliar environment. It's just the next neighborhood. We're familiar with everything else. That's a minor stress. If we're moving to maybe another city, well, then we're going to feel a bit more stress about the move. And if we'll be moving to a completely different country where the culture is different and the language is different, well, that will be quite a bigger stress on us as a move. And the last thing that I want to point out is the more you perceive that you cannot handle the stress, the more stress you're going to feel. And that really is a very important aspect, because even when there's a difficult challenge ahead of us that we feel is very stressful, or we would consider very stressful, if we feel that we cannot cope, or we feel that we are not prepared to handle it, we will probably feel even more stress with it. Next slide, Janna. So now I really want to emphasize the fact that we are all educators, we work in schools, and while everybody's feeling stressed, no matter where we work and what we do in life, I want to highlight a little bit what educators and people like us who work with young people, how stress affects us and our work in particular. So obviously, when we're feeling stressed and we're having a hard time handling our own emotions and our own stress, it's more difficult for us to do our job as efficiently as we should, right? Or as we want to. For example, offering praise, being nurturing to kids, to our students, maybe providing the structure and the kind of support that they need. Maybe we're not as patient, and maybe we might be harsher in our discipline than we ought to be. I've never been a classroom teacher, but I am a parent, and I know I'm guilty of that harsher discipline and lack of patience once in a while when I'm very stressed. It may be more difficult to be empathetic and to care and to engage in the way that we want with the people that we are working with. And lastly, it can lead to absenteeism, right? Burnout, and that affects the stability and the consistency that our students need. So in terms of managing stress, this is not just about us, which is obviously the most important thing, is for us to be able to manage the stress, but it's how the stress affects our work and then our sense of ourselves as teachers and educators. Next slide, please, Janna. So today we want to talk a little bit about resilience. How can we modulate some of that stress? How can we be able to handle the difficult challenges that we're going through as best as we can? And in terms of resilience, what we say when a person is resilient, or what is resilient, what it is being resilient, is the ability to possess or having mental processes or behaviors that give you the ability to manage, to bounce back, and to deal with the difficulties and the challenges and the stressful circumstances that you encounter. In other words, it's coping strategies. And I want to remind you that we are capable of working on that. Sometimes resilience is not something we're born with. We can have maybe traits that make us a little bit easier at getting to be resilient. But most times resilient is something that is learned, and the mind is trainable. We can help ourselves develop ways of coping and ways of dealing with the hardships that we encounter in everyday life. Next slide, Janna. So again, in terms of the dividing the aspects of resilience, we look at the mental processes. These are things like mindset, our narrative, what we say to ourselves, our thoughts, our beliefs. And then there's behavior. It's things that we do, habits, rituals, how we relate to one another. Next slide, Janna. And another way to look at it, and especially in sort of the COVID-19 lens, it's the way we think, or the mindset has different components to it and how we can handle that. And then there's things that we can do, like habits, daily activities. You've mentioned a few just now. Cultivating and fostering connections, self-care. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how we think and mindset. What are those strategies that we can use in order to train our mind to get a better handle on how to to deal with that innate need that we have, or an innate tendency that humans have to focus on fear, on uncertainty, and on negative aspects. And Janna will later talk to us about the things that we can actually do to help ourselves. Next slide, Janna. So let's talk a little bit about acceptance. I'm sure that you have probably come across this over the last year. What can we control? What can we not control in this situation in COVID-19, right? We, you know, maybe at the beginning we felt that it will be a few weeks and it will all pass, but as the months have gone on, we realize that there's very little control over this, and we just have to kind of accept that this is something that we are going to have to live with, and maybe live with for a while. And by accepting, it doesn't mean to be resigned and to simply, you know, give up. That's not what we mean by acceptance. Acceptance is more the ability to understand that there are some things that we are able to do something about, and then there are some things that we're not. And what are we able to do in this situation? Can we accept that this is how things are, but still have the ability to find ways to control some of the things that we could do to help ourselves? And that brings me to learning to tolerate uncertainty, right? But in reality, uncertainty is something that is part of life. Uncertainty is not something that we're just discovering now through COVID-19. If we think about it, uncertainty is part of life. We live in a world that is unpredictable. We never know what comes on to us, you know, in any day, practically. But by ability to tolerate uncertainty, it's the ability to handle the situation and know that this unpleasant feeling that we're feeling in our bodies, that we don't know what will happen, we want to have more answers, but we don't have them. That ability is something that we can handle. We can have that feeling and still feel joy. We can have that uncertain feeling and still be able to go about our lives and figure out other things that can make us enjoy life and plan and hope and be able to cope with everyday things that we are experiencing. And when we talk about emotions, we talk about self-regulating emotions, that really is the key that comes into tolerating that uncertainty. And I want to talk a little bit about emotions and what it means to tolerate emotions, or what it means to self-regulate. We know that emotions are very much tied to what we say and our language. And we often in our, you know, in the Western world, we tend to think of emotions as that we have to be very positive with our emotions. And if we're feeling emotions that are unpleasant, we call them bad emotions, and we try to push them away and not really face them. But in reality, emotions all, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant, serve as a purpose in everything that we do. And we can feel unpleasant emotions and at the same time be able to cope. We can feel unpleasant emotions and be able to still feel joy at the same time. So you can be frustrated about the situation, but you can still feel joy about, you know, maybe accomplishing something at work, or spending time with your kids, or going for a wonderful walk in the park. And that's sometimes something we're not quite aware of. We feel like we need to take the bad emotions out before we can actually feel good about ourselves. And I just want to skip to the next slide, please, Janna. There's a concept called emotional granularity, and emotional granularity means the ability to distinguish between a range of emotions and label your emotions with discrete and specific terms. And what that means is that if we are able to be more specific on what it is that is bothering us, or what it is that the emotion is trying to tell us, we are able to handle it better. This is something actually we work with young kids when we talk about self-regulation. So the wheel shows you that there are a range of emotions. It's very hard to see, but the ones really in the center are just general emotions, like bad. or mad. And that doesn't really describe much. When you're saying, I feel bad or I feel mad, it colors your whole day. It colors everything that you do. But if you could become more granular and say, well, I feel bad because I'm disappointed that I can't see my grandparents, or I can't see my parents. That is specific to that particular situation. You're disappointed that you can't see your parents, but you're still happy because you have had a really good experience today at your workplace, or you managed to learn something new, maybe in terms of something that you've tried to do that you haven't done before. So the discrete and specific emotion that you're describing allows you to sort of narrow it down into something that is really does not generalize to your whole day and your whole well-being. And that allows us to handle things better. If we're just mad and we're just sad, it just colors everything that we do. And we know that language plays a big, big role in this. And I will ask Janna to go back to the previous slide. And that brings me to the next one, which is changing our narrative. What we say to ourselves is really how we conduct our lives, or how we end up thinking about what we do. Our narrative is really the way we interpret the world around us. We use language to do so. And the wonderful thing about humans is that we have imagination and we have language. And that's a very important part of being human, right? And being able to cope. And our ability to use language and imagination allows us to plan, it allows us to think ahead of things, it allows us to set goals, but also it can allow us to see possibilities in the future. And if we are looking at possibilities in the future that are not going to turn out well, that's going to get us into a lot of bad emotions and a lot of stress, right? If we're able to look and imagine and use our language to imagine possibilities that are more positive and are more realistic, then maybe we can think about the future as more optimistic. Likewise, if we have self-doubt and say things like, I'm never going to be able to do it, or if we feel helpless and say, I will never be able to cope, or I can't do this. These are the kind of narrative that allow us to feel those difficult emotions on a regular basis. But maybe we can change that narrative a little bit. Maybe we can say, this is a difficult situation, but I can still handle it. I can still do X or Y in order to be able to get through it. So think about how you're saying things to yourself. What are you thinking about? And how your language really directs what you're doing and how you're feeling. And the last point that I want to talk about is taking it day by day. I think that it's very difficult to figure out the next year, the next month even. And sometimes just accepting that you need to get through this day, and today is the only day you can plan for, can take away some of that pressure of thinking about all the different things that you feel like you need to achieve in the next month or in the next week. Just limiting your horizon to small increments of time allows us to feel a little bit more control on what is happening in our lives. And we do want that control, right? Even though we may not have it, that is one way that we can feel some control over our lives. Thinking ahead in little increments. If you got through the day, if it was a decent day, you got home, you're setting the alarm clock for the next day, well, that's a good day. That means you're ready to go for the next day and you're planning your next day. And that should be something to celebrate, right? Things have gone okay. And I feel that for me, that is one of the things that really has helped me as well in getting through this pandemic, just looking at it day by day, week by week, and hoping, of course, but still not looking too much into the horizon and wondering and worrying. Next slide, Janna. So I would like you now maybe again to take a couple of minutes and to look and introspect a little bit based on some of the things that I've discussed and some of the things that maybe you have been doing, maybe you have been doing some of them. How can you find some consolation in your thoughts? What do you do to find consolation in your thoughts in difficult times? And I'm going to look in the chat and we'll share some of your thoughts as well in a couple of minutes. So first of all, it's wonderful to see how many of you are weighing in the chat. There's some wonderful things that have come up, and I see that many of you have already used some of the practices that I've mentioned. Many of you have talked about storytelling, changing the narrative, accepting and having daily affirmation. That's for me the quotes. I relate to that one. Positive self-talk. Taking it day by day, I see that in the chat. So I'm glad to see that many of you are using some of these strategies already, and that you have had ways of finding ways to console yourself in these difficult times. Thank you very much for all the sharing.
So we're going to continue the discussion around resilience, and really one way to understand how resilience develops is to take a look at this image of a balance scale or a seesaw, and this probably is something that you've seen before. And the way it works really is that our protective experiences and our coping skills, as Zmira referred to before, they're on one side that have the ability to counterbalance these sort of adversities that we experience on the other side. Okay, and it's evident, resilience becomes evident when our health and our well-being and our development tips towards these positive outcomes. Even when the load is really heavy and really stacked against us, we all know of people who seem to have it really tough, but yet they seem to be managing okay, or they're keeping their heads above water. And perhaps, that's part of what you do as well. And we ask ourselves, how is this possible and what's going on? Because it's not just like an absolute of a weighting system here. There's a part that's very individual, and that's the fulcrum on this balance scale, right? If we look at where our fulcrum is positioned, everyone has a different position potentially as to where their fulcrum is located. And that's really going to determine how easy or how difficult it is to tip that balance scale in one direction or the other. And that's really determined by many factors. Our individual experiences, what we bring to the table, what's our genetic makeup, what's our personality traits, how do those coping skills that kind of are internal with us play out. But then there's also our external resources and the supports that we receive, outside of ourselves that help to shift this. So that's why we react to stress and hardship differently. We could sort of look at two people who have a similar sort of scale, but it's being tipped in different ways depending on where that fulcrum is positioned. And COVID's no different. We all know of people who are faring pretty well. And we all know of people who are really having a difficult time and struggling, rightfully so, with what we're living right now. And the hope is really that, with time, when we think of resilience, like Zmira said, it's really on a continuum, right? These are things that we can build and enhance. And the hope is that this cumulative impact, of positive experiences, of developing our own resources and our own coping strategies will shift that fulcrum's position and make it easier for us, to receive these positive outcomes. So how do we sort of build our toolkit, and how do we find ways to shift that and make it more possible to be resilient? Well, there's a number of ways that we can do this. So for ourselves and for our students, what we really want to be able to do is unload that negative side, right? All those things that are piling up. But the truth is we can't actually just take them off the scale, right? We can't get away from physical distancing right now. It's part of what we have to do. We have to wear PPE in our workplaces and when we're out in public. High schools are doing this hybrid online in-person thing, that has its own challenges. We're faced with loved ones who've been ill or ourselves who've been ill. College students have been online for a very long time now. So there's lots of things that we can't actually take off of the scale. And so this sort of goes back to what Zmira was speaking about earlier about this mindset and how we choose to view things that can help to unload this negative side. Okay, so I just want to take a moment to share a story with you about this ability to shift our mindset. And really, because we can't just take these things away, we need to do other things. And one of the things that Zmira and I learned from a teacher that we were working with is this permission to give ourselves grace and really being able to reframe things for ourselves and for others. And where this came up was Zmira and I worked together in a high school, and staff members had gone to the administration and said, like, we're really struggling and we need someone to talk to, or we need something. So from that was born this, for lack of a better word, Zmira, I'd call it like a peer support group that we were running over lunchtime for any staff member that just wanted to come and have a space to share. And we were lucky enough that we had a large enough space where we could come, bring our lunch, physically distance. And this wonderful teacher talked about how she was struggling to teach her current group of Cycle 1 students, a group of special needs students. And she shared her struggles. And then I asked her, how are you managing to do this though? Like, you are coming to work every single day and you're teaching these kids and you're sitting here right now on your lunch talking to us. Like, how are you managing to make all that happen? And she said, I had to give myself and my students grace and acknowledge and accept that. She said that she has to teach it a different way than she's used to right now. And she couldn't teach and interact as she typically does. And she felt that, trying to maintain that not only felt impossible, but it was creating this level of distress within her that was becoming like at a tipping point. And by giving grace, I don't mean that we are skirting our responsibilities. I don't mean that we're slacking off in some way or that we're sort of dropping the bar. Quite the contrary. She said that when I asked her to tell me more, she said it was important to shift this expectation she had on herself, because this is something that's happening outside of her. She knows that this is a temporary thing that she has to do, and that her typical style of teaching needed to shift because she was feeling less competent and less effective as a teacher. And when she gave herself this grace and she gave herself this permission, she was able to shed some of this stress. And it didn't negate her passion that she had for teaching, and it didn't negate the commitment she had to her students or her desire to connect with them. It just helped her to sort of reframe. And it didn't make it all go away. It was still and is still stressful, but it shifted that for her. And she also mentioned the importance of actively naming her stress. And she did a really good job of that day, you know, to say that this is what I'm living. And she claimed that just by saying it out loud, it sort of took the pressure off a little bit. We don't manage stress by ruminating about it, but on the contrary, she felt that by naming it, she was then able to sort of say, okay, now what do I need to do? What's next? And how do I get through, as Zmira said, this moment or this day or this week? So if we're able to do that and we can, you know, unload some of that negative side, we also want to look at how we can load up on that positive side. And one thing that resilient people have in common, students, staff, you know, humans, is stable and committed relationships. Okay, whether it's with your caregivers, with your parents, as a teacher, coach, you know, your own children. And this isn't really new information for us. We all know that supportive and strong relationships foster and promote resilience. And the reason really is we're made that way. We are social creatures, and not a single one of us has gotten to where we are today by ourselves. You know, we talk about, and we often think of resilience as being something that's sort of innate within us and comes from the individual self, which a part of it does. But perhaps even a larger part of it comes from our social connections, you know, the way in which we bond and connect to other people. That gives us a sense of safety and security and wellness. You know, in fact, it was, I think, at LCEEQ a few years back where I listened to Michael Unger speak about resilience in the social context. And it really kind of opened my eyes to what is necessary outside of ourselves, those external resources that we tap into that really we rely on to be resilient. So we want to spend some time now to talk about how we actually go about making that possible. So what does it really mean to have responsive relationships? Because like I said, we all know that we require connection, that it's a natural drive within us. But we usually kind of stop there in the conversation and say like, well, of course, that makes complete sense. But today I want us to go a little bit further and talk a little bit more about how we actually do this. Like, how do we actually create and maintain these types of relationships in our lives? Because they really truly do buffer us against hardship. And just because we care about somebody or we have a relationship with somebody and many people, it doesn't mean that those relationships are necessarily healthy or that they're providing the type of response that is necessary, you know, to build resilience over time. And this goes for our most intimate relationships, but this also applies to our sort of more generic relationships out there in the world, in our workplaces, with our colleagues, with our students, in our community, with strangers. We could apply this to all those situations. So before I go into more detail about, you know, how we actually foster this intentionally, I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that this is so strong. Okay, this drive in us is so innate to connect with others that even during a world pandemic, okay, where we have to be apart, it has not stopped us from connecting. And I think that's important that we highlight that and we really focus in on that. It's important to think about and recognize that we've not stopped connecting during this past year, and we never will. It's just too strong of a need within us as humans. But what we have done is we've adapted. And adaptation is one of the key components to being resilient, right? Resilient people know how to adapt. We've often heard the word pivot. I heard the word pivot a lot during this past year. But really, that's what we do. And that's another way in which we can sort of tap ourselves on the shoulder and say like, hey, we are resilient because we're learning how to adapt and live in this world, even if we don't really want it this way. We know we don't want it this way. So I want to take a moment and just share with you some images of people, you know, just like us, who are adapting and still finding ways to connect. And this is a common image that I see in my neighborhood. You know, two people sitting on a park bench, you know, seemingly engaging in good conversation, finding a way to get outside and still be together. I love this need to express our affection towards one another, even from afar. I know that this isn't the same as a hug, squeezed in nice and tight, but look at that little girl's face and look at the woman. You can't see her face front on, but you can see that they are connecting and there's joy that's being created here, despite the fact that it's from afar. I love this one. I don't know if anyone has seen, this is actually a photo lifted off of a video. And this was taken on Mother's Day during the first shutdown. Like, who would have thought we'd still be here? But this is a woman who desperately missed her mother and found a creative way to rig a contraption that allowed them to slip their arms into these plastic slots and give each other a big hug. And like I said, it's part of a video that shows it from the beginning. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you. It's really touching, and you know, disclaimer, it might make your eyes sting a little bit. I absolutely love this. I couldn't resist but putting this in. I mean, these are two neighbors, right? I mean, maybe they're family, maybe they're not, but regardless, their desire to connect, and clearly their skill and creativity as well, led them to developing this. I mean, how awesome is this? But you would never do this if the desire to connect with other people wasn't so strong, okay? They dropped their fence and they're sharing a beer together. And we're doing the same kind of things in our schools, okay, around connecting. It's definitely different, but you know, here's a teacher with her class, masked and separated, but everyone's engaged, it appears, and looking towards their teacher or to whoever's speaking, and being part of this experience. And the same with our younger children. Okay, despite the screens and despite the masks, we are finding ways to do this and to make it work in a way, in the best way that we can. And I love this one too. I mean, look at the smiles on those faces. And you can't see the little boy's face, but you can kind of see his eye on the side of his face, and you can see where it's kind of scrunched up as if he's smiling too, whether this is to his grandparents or great-grandparents, or maybe they're strangers that they were walking by. But this is a real moment of joy and connection, despite the fact that your face is pressed up against a piece of glass. And, you know, for some of us, these images make us feel sad, and that's completely understandable. I choose to see these as sort of being hopeful and frankly, a testament to the enduring bonds that we have and that we seek no matter what. You know, even when we have to stay away, we find ways. And it just, to me, serves to, you know, highlight the importance, you know, of all of this. And, you know, for many of us, this doesn't feel like enough, because it's not. And it's just, it doesn't feel like enough for us. And it's not. We desire more, and we desire it in a way that feels natural. To connect with your students, whether it's leading your schools, supporting your staff, you know, seeing your family and friends. But again, nonetheless, we do adapt, and we find ways to make it work with what we have. And though the conditions are not desirable, here we are, you know. And for many of us, our circle of people is very small right now, right? Particularly in the province of Quebec. We've had we've had a rough go, you know, and even in comparison to other parts of the country. I'm from the East Coast, and, you know, they're living a different life out there. It's not easy. I'm not trying to just tout one region against another, but to acknowledge that our circles are very small. And if you live alone, well, technically your circle is at its smallest. It consists of you mostly, you know. maybe many of us on this call leave our homes to go into schools and centers and work, but maybe a number of us are also working from home. And certainly that's the case for many, many people, you know, in my circles. So I'm a family of 5. You know, I have 4 other people in my home that I can connect with. But just because you have people around you, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're engaging in a responsive way. Okay, so we're going to go back to this idea of how do we foster responsive relationships in a way that builds resilience for us? How do we get the most out of these relationships? Again, whether they're your most intimate relationships with your partners and your children and your extended family, or these is with your colleagues and your students, you know, and your community at large. So let's take some time to think about how we build this, because it truly, truly is a buffer, you know, and a protector at this time. So when we think about how do we get the most out of our relationships, how do we communicate in a way that strengthens our relationships? You know, and I'm going to preface this by saying a few weeks ago, I did a training on resilience, which was actually quite timely for this workshop. And in this training, it talked about, we often gauge the strength of our relationship based on a question like, will you be there for a person when things go wrong? And if you can ask yourself that question and answer it, you know, that gives you a sense of like, where do you fit in with this person, or where do you fit in, you know, with your community? But research is showing us that there may be a better question that to ask ourselves, that which may actually be a stronger predictor of the quality of our relationships. And more importantly, it's maybe even more important to pay attention to than, are we going to be there for someone when things go wrong? And this is the work of Dr. Shelley Gable from the University of Santa Barbara. And she suggests, while it's really important, obviously, to be there for people in a time of need, sometimes that's easier to do, and that we need to pay closer attention to the way we respond to those that we care about when things go well. So will you be there for me when things go right? And by asking this question and responding in a specific way, we can really strengthen relationships and provide, you know, a sense of well-being, a sense of attunement for both people. Okay, or the way we respond can actually serve to erode that relationship and drive disconnection over time. So this was really interesting to me, because at this point in the training, I thought, it never occurred to me to really think about how I respond to people when things go right. I just was under the assumption that someone comes to share something positive with me, well, then that's just positive, right? It's positive equals positive. So this is interesting. I'm intrigued. I want to know more. So I'm going to explain more. So according to Dr. Shelley Gable, when someone comes to us to share something positive, to share good news, we respond in one of 4 ways. But only one of those ways in which we respond actually serves to strengthen our relationships. Okay, so on the screen, and I'll go into these in a little bit more detail in a second, but the way these ways of responding are classified or categorized can give you a good idea of what we're talking about here. Okay, so, you know, are you a conversation killer? Are you a conversation hijacker? Are you a joy thief? Or are you a joy multiplier? And before I go into more detail, like I said, that the titles sort of give you a good sense. At this point, I'm thinking like, well, obviously I'm a joy multiplier. I mean, I enjoy engaging with people. I'm generally an optimistic person. I tend to see the world, you know, the glass is kind of half full. I've got this. This is kind of obvious to me at this point that I'm a joy multiplier. And then she went into some details about what we really mean, what she really means by the way in which we respond. And I had to sort of check myself at this point. So if you're engaging with somebody and you're being a conversation killer, whether this is towards, you know, your colleagues or your student, your spouse, your friends, your own children, how do we kill conversations? Well, we kill them by being distracted, and we are a very distracted society right now. as well as through our disengagement. So someone comes to you to share something positive, which, by the way, first should alert you to the importance of this experience. I mean, someone is coming to you, someone's coming to me to share something positive. That means that we represent something important to this person. So that's our first clue. And are we giving, our full attention? Are we able to put the distractions away? Are we able to put our phones down? There's those physical distractions, but then there's the sort of internal distractions. Can we actually orient our bodies and our minds towards that person, and make it so that we're really giving them our undivided attention, in this moment? We've all been in situations where we're trying to communicate something to somebody and we don't have their full engagement and they are distracted. And we know what happens. It really does kill the conversation. And more importantly, it can send the message that I don't really have time for you right now. And as she's explaining this, I think, ooh, I think I do that a lot with my kids, without being too tough on myself. It was really opening my eyes to, like, I'm distracted a lot. And even if it's not, because I have a phone in my hand, I've got a million things running through my head. I've got 3 young kids, I'm working full time, we're in a pandemic, there's a ton of needs. I'm oftentimes just not totally engaged when someone's trying to share with me. So that made me take a little step back. And then she talked about, being a conversation hijacker. And simply put, that's when we shift the light, right? Someone's shining a light on themselves and sharing something positive, and we take that light and we shift it towards ourselves. And we're not doing this because we're a jerk, and we're not doing this because we're narcissistic. It's actually, there's good intention behind that. We're actually doing it because we're trying to relate to people. We're trying to, join somebody in a moment, but when we sort of take away the moment from somebody else, we're not really tapping in and being attuned to what the other person needs. And the third way that we erode in our responses is to be a joy thief. And that's when a person comes excited to share something or feeling positive about, an idea or an event, or just a very mundane everyday thing. And instead of coming alongside that person and sharing in their good news and sharing in their positivity, we instead point out all the problems and all the downsides to this good news. And it sucks the positive emotion right out of that person. And as she's describing this, I thought, oh man, last week, I got home from doing groceries. I walk in the door, I drop down the bags, and my 10-year-old bounces up to me and says, Mommy, guess what? I'm gonna sell slime and make lots of money. I don't know if any of you got kids, but this whole slime deal, like, I figured we'd be over it by now, but it's only revved up during COVID. So she says this, and my first thought, I go into my own thoughts and I say, hey, you know what? When I was in school, there was this kid named Malcolm who used to sell Jolly Ranchers out of his locker for 50 cents a pop, and he made a killing. So what did I do right there? I just hijacked her conversation by having this thought. I'm trying to relate to her, but I totally, stepped right into her spotlight. And then she says, no, I don't want to sell the slime at school. I want to sell it online because I'll make more money. Well, what do you think happened then? Well, Della, I mean, geez, that gets really complicated. You got to manage people, and you have to collect addresses, and you got to actually ship this stuff and collect money. And then you're responsible if something goes wrong and someone doesn't get there. And as I'm spewing all this, negative things that could happen and stealing her joy, she just looked at me and said, Mom, you know what? You're taking something that I thought was going to be really fun, and you're just making it a problem. And I thought, that's exactly what I just did. 100%, that is what I did. So what she's trying to remind us to do and to spend more time is just to be mindful of our responses. That being a joy multiplier means that we mirror a person's excitement, okay, and their positive energy, that we want to share in their joy. We want to ask questions, to help a person unpack this experience. And when we do this and we come alongside somebody, we do become more connected, and we strengthen those relationships, and communication gets built in a positive way, as long as trust and belonging and intimacy. And I think I realized in this training that I'm better at this outside of my most intimate relationships. And yet It's perhaps my most intimate relationships where I need to maybe spend a little bit more time thinking about these responses. And it's not to beat ourselves up, okay? Because we're not always going to be joy multipliers, right? Life is going to lead us to be distracted, and sometimes for good reason, okay? And sometimes our excitement to share and connect with others is going to interrupt their flow, and that's going to happen. And sometimes people's positive news or ideas, like, my 5-year-old deciding she's now old enough to go walk the dog around the park by herself, it needs to be brought back into check. So it's not always going to be. But the bottom line is that responsive relationships, having strong relationships, helps us to be stronger, helps us to be happier and more resilient. So it's not about being a cheerleader and walking around with your pom-poms out. That's not what we're talking about, and that's not authentic engagement. Authentic engagement requires us to lean into conversations and to just simply engage, ask questions, and just kindle the conversation so that the fire can grow and it can multiply. So I'm just going to shift a little bit, still talking about things we can do to foster our resilience. What we can do is actually focus in on and highlight our own strengths, okay? We all have them, and sometimes, especially in times of challenge, sometimes they get buried and we're not able to sort of recognize what we bring to the table, okay? When we're overwhelmed, we can allow ourselves to sort of go down that rabbit hole of what's not working and what we're not doing that's helping to serve ourselves. So we can ask ourselves, who am I at my best from a character perspective? Who are you at your best? And how we use the best parts of ourselves to overcome challenges can be really interesting, because when we tend to get overwhelmed, we tend to become very deficit focused, right? We start to see the world through a problem focused lens, which, can spiral us further down this kind of rabbit hole. So sometimes in the face of challenge, we're feeling overwhelmed, we forget what incredible strengths we have. And by tapping into our strengths, it creates positive emotion in us. It creates a sense of accomplishment. It creates a sense of control and self-efficacy and all those things that help to mitigate stress. If you're not sure, and I don't know how well you can see, these are 24 character strengths. And this was developed, it's a long-standing survey actually that you can take for free. I wanted to throw it into the chat, but I can't access the chat right now. So if you just Googled VIA character strengths, you're going to get a free survey. You have to sign up for it, but it's not spammy. And what you do is over a course of a period of time, researchers have looked sort of globally at what are the character strengths that are sort of most important to us as humanity. And they've developed these 24 character strengths. So what you can do is take this survey. It's about a 15-minute long survey. And what it does is it takes these 24 character strengths and it ranks them for you. So what are what's your top character strength all the way down to number 24 for you. And the purpose is not to look at your number 24 and say like, oh, great, I don't have any humor and I need to work on that. No, it's quite the opposite. It's really to look at what is it that you do the best? Who are you at your best? And how do you take this piece of you and foster it and use it and pay attention to it and be mindful of it so that you can use it to serve you at your best. So I'll give you some examples. If one of your top strengths is creativity, okay, well, what do you do with that? How do you benefit from that, especially right now? We've required a lot of creativity to make this whole education thing work. Perhaps there's a lot of input that you give in meetings, or you're really good at sort of thinking outside the box with things, or you actually just like to physically create things. I have a friend who I spoke to over the weekend, and she paints on the weekends. Like, she lives alone and she's painting. Like, that's awesome and super creative. And how good is that for us? If humor is one of your strengths, well, we all could use a laugh right now. How do you use your humor? How does it work for you? And if you've forgotten that that's one of your strengths, How do you tap back into that and recognize and see that this can really be something that really does foster and build our resilience? Another one that I thought was really interesting, one of the character strengths is a appreciation of beauty. You know, if you're the type of person who stops and sort of takes in a sunset, or, you know, all the snow on the trees after a snowstorm, that's something that you actually do appreciate. What's the benefit for you to be able to tap into that? Okay, so I encourage you to check out this survey. It's just kind of fun and interesting to see where it can take you. Okay, I want to speak briefly about self-care, but I have to be really honest that as much as I practice self-care, and I think it's an extremely important concept, I also have to say that it's something that can make me cringe sometimes and can be a little bit of a nauseating topic, which sounds really funny coming from a mental health professional. Okay, but I think there are reasons why I feel this way. And I think it's because the concept's not always represented well. And sometimes it feels like it's being shoved down our throats, okay, which flies in the face of what self-care really is. Okay, and there is this billion-dollar industry that's been developed and grown out of this concept. And I think at times it can sort of be misguided and misattuned to our needs, and even at times it can it can create this unwellness in us. And in a way, it's the way sometimes it can be framed. We all know on this call right now that, you know, getting proper sleep and moving our bodies, you know, and taking care and giving ourselves individual time, all these things are important and necessary, and we know that. But self-care sometimes is touted as this sort of like balm for everything. It's going to fix all of our ailments. And it's implied that, you know, this is what you need to feel better. So therefore, you know, you better get your act together and make it happen. You know, and sometimes this pressure to apply self-care in some way actually can make us feel guilty, you know, that like I should be working instead of doing this right now. I should be cleaning. I should be spending more time with my kids or, you know, or my spouse. I don't really have time for this. And that ruins the idea of self-care. And it can put it into this sort of trigger category. And I was also reading about how this idea that we need to spend time with ourselves and we should be, you know, meditating. And if you do, that's fantastic. But for some people, you know, being alone with yourself is not very helpful. You know, if you're a very anxious person whose thoughts can sort of take over for you, that might not be what you want to hear about, you know, in terms of what's best for you. And there's a social pressure that's developed around self-care. We kind of live these parallel lives on social media. And, you know, we kind of choose to present our best selves in this world. And I think it's added to this pressure. And the pressures around self-care are numerous. You know, are you eating well? Are you sleeping well? Have you started hot yoga yet? You know, do you read Gwyneth Paltrow's blogs? And self-care isn't about that. You know, self-care is about being in the moment and tapping into our need for care. Okay, and trying to tune out the social pressures that exist perhaps around that, or the pressures that we put on ourselves. If it feels like it's just one more thing that you have to do, that you have to be good at, that you have to figure out, that we're adding this to our plate, then that's not self-care. Is self-care important, and can it improve mental health and well-being? 100% yes, it can and it does. But in some cases, it seems to have morphed into yet like another way that we need to be perfect or meet this set of demands that's being placed on us. And it takes us out of self-care and it puts us into this pressure zone. So what I want to say about self-care is, if this applies to you, I just want you to take the pressure off, okay? If you want to develop self-care practice and you're not really sure how to do that, how to meet your own needs and how to sort of look at it in a way that works for you, you know, you can talk with people who you know seem to do it and do it well. you can talk to a mental health professional about how to go about doing that. But I think what's most important is that if diving into a great Netflix show is your idea of self-care, then dive in. You know, if it's taking a bath, take your bath. If it's blaring loud music while you wash the dishes, one of my personal favorites, then that works for you, then go for that. Self-care really is your business. And in the words of Christy Parr, who's a journalist who I was reading about, she said, I stopped trying to do self-care and I stopped pushing it. I stopped doing what other people said should make me feel better. And I started doing what I know makes me feel better. And I think that's my hang up with it, is this idea of we need to be told what to do, when we really think about our own personal needs, yes, we might need help to make it happen, but we have to do what makes sense for us and what feels good for us. And in preparing this workshop, I came across some notes I'd taken a long time ago in another course talking about the ABCs of self-care. And I thought, oh, this kind of sums it up for me, that we want to have an awareness. We want to wake up to our own experience that we're sort of currently living and be mindful, of what our needs are. Okay, only we can do that. It's not for somebody else to be able to tell us. So in order to practice self-care, there has to be a certain level of awareness as to where we are currently and what we need. And then we need to find a balance. How do we have personal priorities set for ourselves? And that's easier said than done for some of us. But what boundaries do we need to establish to make that happen? And how do we bring in this idea of a growth mindset, that we're capable of moving ourselves forward? And then, of course, we want to be able to connect. And we've talked a lot about that, how we want to, engage in our supportive relationships in multiple areas of our lives, in our work and in our personal lives, and connect in this non-judgmental way. So speaking of connecting, we're now going to take about 10 minutes and we are going to throw you all into these breakout rooms with a few people. And we really are doing this because we just want people to have a chance to connect, a chance to meet somebody new. I'm assuming most of you will probably be strangers to one another. So all we're going to ask you to do in a moment, you're going to be whisked away to meet with, 5 or 6 other people. And we just want you to introduce yourself, maybe state what your role is, where you work. And then from there, whatever is important to you. Perhaps you want to talk a little bit about what you've learned so far. Maybe you want to talk about, how you do engage in responsive relationships, what resilience means to you, what you do for your own self-care practice. We just want you to take some time to, have our masks off and to connect with one another. So give us a second and we're going to make that happen, fingers crossed.
Nilu, we're depending on you.
Yeah.
And we'll come back in about 10 minutes and then we're going to go on to speak about some things we're going to do for our students. I think so.
I think we're all back. Well, I was in the chat room with some lovely teachers. That was a great experience. I hope you all enjoyed that connection, that moment of connection. So we're going to move quickly because we don't have a lot of time left. Unfortunately, time has gone by quickly for us, and we do want to cover a little bit of what we can do for our students. So in light of what you've heard so far, and in terms of how we foster resilience for ourselves, this is not any different for what we can do for our students. So when we look at this balance and the negative outcomes on one side, the positive outcomes on another side, and the sort of different things that we can do to increase those positive outcomes. There's some things that we can do. There's some things that we are able to do. We all have the capacity to do something, and it doesn't mean we have to do everything. It doesn't mean that we need to have that pressure on ourselves to to go about fixing every difficulty and every challenge our students are having. And by all means, I have a list of different, in the next slide, of different suggestions that that we want to share with you. I'm not going to go through them one by one. We don't have time, but because we're sharing the slides with you, it will be a sort of a reference point for you if you want to look at them in the future. But what we want to convey in the time that we have is that all of us has chosen to work with children. We want to work with the young kids in order to help them grow and thrive, and we can help make a difference in little ways, but it starts with us taking care of ourselves. If we are able, if you remember the slide that I showed you at the beginning, if we are able to modulate some of our stress, we are able to be more empathetic and figure out how to load on those positive outcomes. Teachers, many of you are teachers with a lot of resources, a lot of ideas. In fact, in the chat, there was one teacher sharing an idea with another teacher of a strategy. And I'm not a classroom teacher, so all these academic strategies for hands-on learning and for different strategies to help with engagement, those are things that I'm going to leave for you to explore with your colleagues, who in your school is able to maybe support you, what ideas you have that you can share. That's part of the connection that Janna has been talking about. But what I would like to maybe talk about general things to keep in mind when we're sort of approaching our students and when we're realizing what they're going through. Next slide, Janna. So in terms of young kids, but this goes for older kids as well, we know that we need to deal with their basic needs. I'm not going to say too much about that. This is for students who come from disadvantaged families, and you may need to be mindful about what basic needs are not being met right now at home. Many of these situations have been present even before COVID, and certainly we've been dealing with, supporting these things for years. But this may be exasperated at this time, and what is in your school community is available for you to be able to support some basic needs of the students. Doesn't mean you personally have to do so. Now, kids' view of the world is shaped by their experiences with significant adults. So during the early developments, definitely in the first 10 years of life, their connection, experiences, responsiveness from adults really shapes how they feel about the world and how they handle the world. This is what we call really attachment, right? And regardless from the experiences that your students may have had prior to coming to your classroom or prior to coming to school, their ability to feel connected to you, feel trusted by you, becomes one of the most essential things that they need at this time. And what does that mean? So having a trusted or reliable or responsive adult is really about just listening. It's about knowing that you are going to validate and empathize. And you may not be able to actually do anything to change the situation. You may not always have the solution for your child, for your students. But by just doing that, you will be surprised how you are supporting a child and how you are making a difference. And I can't emphasize that more. Another aspect is experiencing success. Again, whatever you can do within the kids' ability to have that experience. For one child, it might be a little bit better academically, but for another child, the success may not necessarily be academic. The questions that you may ask yourself is, what does this child need right now? What does my student need right now? Does he need to increase his reading skills? Or does he maybe need to be feeling more comfortable in his own skin and feeling less worried about home life or worried about what will happen in terms of COVID or the future? All depends on your student, what age level you're teaching, etc. we are lucky that in Quebec, at least from September, most of the students have been in school, and we know that some haven't, and they have had opportunity to connect with each other. But you'll be surprised how many kids are suffering with lack of connection despite being in school, partly because of the confines of the bubbles, lack of activities after school. A lot of the connection students have come from other things than the classroom. And a lot of them are missing out from that. And we certainly hear definitely from teenagers, how hard it has been socially, the loss of experiences that they may never get back. And if we can foster some opportunities to connect, even online, and encourage that in our students, I think that would be another thing that can load on those positive outcomes. We know that the kids in general need consistency and dependency, and schools in essence are very consistent in dependence. There are bells that ring that tell us it's time for the next lesson. There's routines and schedules. But when I talk now about dependency, I feel more about the dependency on us to be more than just providing the routine. Kids are not having enrichment. They're not having a lot of things that they may be able to access after school. And if they can depend on that playtime, on that connection with an adult, on someone to talk to, on someone to maybe modulate or answer questions, those are the things that I would sort of encourage to do. And of course, the last thing is to maintain that flexibility. Very important for kids to still have the connection, the expectations and the demands. We want to keep things as normal as possible in one way, and to allow them to grow and to progress. But at the same time, we need to be flexible. We need to be flexible for ourselves. So obviously we have to be flexible for our students. And we know that expectations are really what drives stress as well, right? If we expect that things are going to go well, if we expect that we're going to be able to, provide the curriculum as we want to, if we have an expectation that we're going to be able to, do the work as we did before, if we are students, and we don't meet that expectation, that's very difficult for us. So by lowering the expectations a little bit, or by being flexible with the expectation, we can avoid some of those disappointments and those feelings of pressure that we are often faced with. I'm just looking at the time. We have a few minutes, so I'm not going to go to the next slide, although the next slides can you skip maybe to the slide on coping? Just the last slide. Keep going. Thank you. One more. Thank you very much, Janna. So I have all sorts of ideas there. I want to talk about two things. One is art. I'm not an artist, and again, I'm not a teacher, but art is a tool of expression and creation. And it can help reinforce what you feel. It can help reinforce how we express ourselves. And if you have anyone in your schools who can use art, any type of art as a medium to help kids express themselves, I would encourage you to do that. Another one is through coping. And I've added at the end of the slides, which we will share with you, I've added a few links that will have a lot of very, very interesting information that will help you with finding ways and ideas for your classroom. But I want to talk about the toolbox. And a toolbox is not necessarily a box, but it's mechanisms in which you can draw upon in terms of dealing with difficulties. So it's a coping skills. And one of the ways we encourage students to cope is by having things that they can draw upon, and they can sort of pull out from their toolbox. It could be things that comfort them. It could be ideas that have, they generated themselves. And these activities you will find at the PEH PHE website, which is a physical health education website. There's some videos, which I actually wanted to show you, but we are running out of time, on how to create those toolbox and activities within the classroom that will help you create a toolbox. So kids can maybe go for a walk when they need a break. Kids may go to their calm corner in the school. And why it's important is that as kids get older, they need to learn how to deal with their frustrations on their own. And by empowering them to take some steps, you know, what can you do to help yourself? We want to teach kids to problem solve. We want to empathize and we want to validate and we want to listen, but at the same time, we want to teach them to find solutions. Life is tricky. Life is full of challenges with COVID or without COVID. And by gradually teaching kids to think about what can you do to help yourself? How can you empower yourself right now to deal with the frustration that you're feeling? That is one of the most important things that we can teach beyond the actual learning of the curriculum in a school. And that's certainly what we do as mental health professionals. Those various coping skills that students can draw upon. Even young kids, even kids in kindergarten can already learn to help themselves in minor ways, and gradually, hopefully when they get older, they're able to actually access those kind of skills. When we talk about self-regulation, this is what we're talking about, being able to feel that frustration and that anger or that unpleasant emotion, but find ways to get through it and move on and still be a learner and still find joy in what we do every day. So I think we have run out of time, and I'm correct. There have been a lot of questions. I want to first of all thank everyone who's been sharing some of the links. So I think there was Claudine who shared the link in Janna's part shared a link, and Nilo the link for the survey. And you will see, we will share the PowerPoint with you. You will have links at the end that will have a lot of resources that we hope will be useful for you. I don't know if we have any more time for answering a few questions. There were some questions. Do we have a few minutes to go on to questions?
Absolutely, if anybody would like to stay and engage a few minutes.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions that came up as Janna was talking. So one question was, how do we encourage those who feel alone without supportive relationship, those who are experiencing the isolation? This is a tricky one, but I think if we draw back onto some of the things that we mentioned, and try and figure out that there are ways to connect beyond that face-to-face connection in actual, presence of the person. And by, the person who asked this question is obviously knows somebody who needs that kind of connection. And by you connecting to that person, even if it is only online, or only through text or in other means, you are already supporting the person and allowing that person to have some kind of connection and relationship with you. Another comment that was made is, regarding the self-care, when Janna talked about self-care, feeling guilty when you're not self-caring. So I think Janna kind of answered that quite clearly. All of us feel like we need to do our work and we can't take care of ourselves. The work comes first. But I really want to remind you, and here are the points on the screen, that taking care of yourself is the best way for you to be able to take care of others, right? If you find ways to reduce your stress, you are going to do your work better, and you're going to be a more effective teacher, more effective administrator, a more effective psychologist, right? Remember to talk to your colleagues, to share, to support each other. You will be surprised how many ideas have come up over the last year with learning on Zoom differently, strategies in the classroom. share and talk and support each other. And not only you will find a way to connect this way, you will learn new ways to handle some of the things that maybe you need to handle. And the last thing that I want to mention is that you are making a difference in someone's life. We chose to work with young people, to shape their minds, to shape their education. And I don't think there is anything more important in what we do than remembering that every day. So thank you very much for everyone who was here.
Thank you, guys. I echo what Zmira said and really appreciate you taking the time to be with us this morning. And I wish you a beautiful rest of the day.